Today I'm making the world's darkest dark saber. Here's how I did it using the world's blackest paint. Ever since I saw the dark saber on the Mandalorian, I knew I had to try and make my own version of it. Like Stan Edgar, Moff Gideon said, mesmerizing, isn't it? And I have to agree. Now this build really beat me from beginning to end. I'll show you in a minute. First off, I had to figure out how to get the effect. Now there were several of these ultra black paints available that I could use. Vantablack is the most famous version of this, but it has a few problems. For one thing, one guy has the exclusive rights to use it. Needless to say, I'm not about to spend several $1,000s on this just because someone decided to mark up the price beyond anything reasonable. Then I looked into what are the usable ones for people with more sense than money. There are essentially two of these, Black 3.0 and Musou Black. Now there is a bit of a debate going on as to which of these is blacker, but I went with Musou Black for several reasons. The big one being that it seems to genuinely be the blackest paint on the market that's also affordable. The second reason being I didn't like the lies Stuart Simple put out about Musou Black being toxic and unsafe to work with. He even claimed it smelled extremely bad, and honestly it's not different than most paints in terms of smell. This is even odder considering all these ultra black paints work under the same principles. They are some kind of carbon-based nanomaterial that builds up in layers to dissipate the light so much it appears like no light reflects off of it. They're all super delicate and all build up in layers. Now on to printing and modifying the blade. I bought these files because my modeling skills are very slow and not as good for this kind of work, and a lot of people have modeled the dark saber, so I figured why bother. Work smarter, not harder. If you have an idea, odds are others have had it and have even implemented it. Initially I wanted to do a little bit of 3D printed kit bashing and use files from a couple different sets I bought and the Adafruit dark saber files, and I got a fair way through the project and even cut open slots for the Adafruit button and electronics to fit in. But I'm gonna be honest, I was taking a while with this project and wanted to move on to other things, so instead of using the maker prop board and NeoPixels I had originally bought, I settled on trying to put an LED strip inside the blade. However, it didn't quite go in properly, so I just placed it on the bottom of the blade to hide it properly when it's up against a table or a wall. Eventually I'll try to put in the board and the NeoPixels, but for now a cheap LED strip from Amazon will do. First I printed the handle of the blade. I scaled the blade up a bit in order to accommodate the prop board and split it at the seam. Then with a bit of cyanoacrylate glue I fused it back together. After that I sanded it down and coated it with a bit of resin to hide the crime, so to speak. I also printed the pommel for the hilt. I initially tried to fuse it with just resin, but that didn't work well. Maybe it would work if I put in the right kind of resin or built it up in layers, but again I wanted to move on to other projects. Now I printed the blade, and that was an adventure in and of itself. I first used Elgo transparent resin, and no, do not use that stuff. It came out all yellow and didn't work well at all. It looked like it had been in the sun for ages. I even attempted to retrobrite, which was a process developed to fix old electronic plastic with Salon Cream 40, and it still didn't do anything. After that failure, I got my hands on some Sunlu transparent resin. Now this is the right resin for making transparent resin prints. Trust me guys, don't even bother with Elgo's transparent resin unless you are purposely trying to go for an aged look. It looks like glass, and honestly it cuts like it too, so be careful when clearing off supports. Don't forget to wear goggles so you don't cut your eyes when a piece flies off, along with the mandatory gloves which you should have on the majority of the time when you are using resin anyways. You don't want to develop an allergy when handling this stuff over time, so consider a respirator depending on where you are keeping your printers. Now I'll do the fusing of the blade, which is a little different on this. If I use glue on this, you'd see the seams on the blades, so I had to get a bit more creative and more importantly patient. Instead of a glue, I used the regular transparent resin to coat the blade. Here's the bad part. I had to expose it to UV for an unusually long time to ensure the seams stayed intact. I also had to leave it in my living room for a few days with some light exposure to ensure the seam wouldn't suddenly come undone. Yes, that happened to me at one point. My reasoning for thinking that just resin would work this time versus what I did with the handle is due to transparency. I figured that since this is transparent, the UV from the sun could cause the inner layers of resin to cure. This method is a bit of a problem for a couple reasons. The longer exposure to UV means the transparent blade could potentially start to yellow a bit, and it takes days of indirect exposure after the initial blast of UV from the flashlight for this to work. Fortunately, after a couple failed attempts, it worked. Yeah, my scaling is a bit off and I ended up with a 4-foot resin blade, but it worked. This thing feels absolutely ridiculous. Time for the best part. Painting. I used Rust-Oleum automotive primer on both the hilt and the blade. I hit the hilt with Rust-Oleum satin black as a base coat, then taped it off and used Rust-Oleum matte black for the more raised metallic pieces. After that, it's time to work with the world's darkest paint. I first roughed up the surface a bit to help the paint adhere more. I diluted the paint with a bit of water and began spraying it on the blade with my airbrush. Now for the more interesting part of painting. Working with musou black. After a bunch of research, I took a couple approaches and combined them into one. I taped off part of the blade and primed it. Once the blade was primed with Rust-Oleum automotive filler primer, I roughed up the surface and started to airbrush the paint on the blade. You could use a brush, but the best results come with airbrushing the paint on. Otherwise, the blackness is going to be reduced by a lot. To add a little more darkness to this, I took my sweet time with this by hitting it with 1 to 2 coats a day for about a week, with the final number of coats being 10. Now this works because it builds up the nano coating on the blade layer by layer, allowing it to dissipate the light better. Yes, this paint doesn't absorb light so much as dissipate it in such a way as to make it seem like no light is reflected at all. I can show you this by using a high powered enough flashlight, in this case a lot used by firefighters, which causes the paint to show its texture more so than it would under normal lighting conditions. This is all due to the texture this paint produces. When looking at it under a microscope, it has a velvet-like structure that disperses the light, kind of reminiscent of a dense forest. Isn't science fun? Now, while this turned out pretty good, I have to mention some caveats. The paint is delicate. Not as delicate as I have been led to believe, granted this could be the result of using an automotive filler primer as opposed to standard primer, but still delicate. As of right now, there isn't a good method of protecting this paint. No clear coat can be put on this without damaging the dark paint effect. Someone did develop a method for using floor sealer to protect it, but I haven't had a chance to test this out yet. All this to say that this paint will come off with enough friction and even come off if you try to dust it. Not completely, but enough to be seen on whatever you're using to dust it. However, whatever you do, make sure to keep whatever you coat in this paint in a safe dust-free place most of the time, or at least make sure it doesn't get too dusty. Now, I debated discussing the electronics on this build for a while, and I ultimately ended up using a basic LED strip. Like I said before, I originally planned to do something based with the Adafruit version, utilizing a prop board and coding it to make sounds, and I even wanted to get the NeoPixel working in it, but honestly I tried and realized that this is a bit overkill for this build. The hilt is too delicate to be used to swing around with the blade inserted in it. So in the end, I settled on just using a regular LED strip with a small USB battery from Amazon. Like I said before, I'll probably try to get the prop board working on this eventually, maybe in a version 2.0. Finally, I put everything together and here is the moment you've all been waiting for. Finished build. It isn't flawless, but I like how it turned out. The light breaking through the black looks really good and honestly better than I expected. It really replicates the effect from the TV show quite well and even blurs a bit like the one on the TV show does. Except this has the benefit of being an actual physical thing and not a CGI modified prop. While too delicate to swing around, this will make a really cool lamp for the fans of the Mandalorian and can give us some nice ambiance to a room. I hope you all enjoyed this and I hope my work with musou black inspires some of you to do something interesting with it yourselves.